Hi there. Welcome to the Sober Circle channel. Enjoy this speaker tape.
And talked about something called AA. Oh, God, it sounded wonderful. 3 of these men I knew by reputation. One was a member of Lynchburg City Council. One was an executive in one of the largest construction firms in the South. One was part owner in the largest independently owned department stores chain south of the Mason-Dixon line. I had absolutely nothing in common with these people. They represented something that I hated with a passion. Success, because I'd never had it. But the fourth one was one just like me. A wino. An old boy that I had spent a lot of time in jail with. A lot of winters on the riverbank with. Several trips to the nut house with. His name was Ham Masters. And remember that name if there's time I may mention him again. I had even spent one winter there in Lynchburg with Ham in an old abandoned perfume factory. As well as I can remember, this was a 3-story building with a basement. And we started out early that fall up on the top floor, and by spring we had drank and burnt our way all the way to the basement. But the only thing I can say for drinking that perfume is even when you puke, you smell good. Come spring, the police got us out of there because they was going to tear it down, and of course we went to jail. But not in the patrol car, not even in the paddy wagon. We went on the city garbage truck. But when I recognized old Ham, of course I offered him a drink. And he kind of smiled and he says, "Talbot, through the grace of God, I haven't had a drink for 3 years." Hell, I knew nobody had been 3 years without a drink. Certainly not Ham Masters, because like I say, he was one just like me. But what shook me more than anything else were the words, "through the grace of God." You see, Ham Masters was an atheist. In fact, the last time he and I had been together, we were in the Norfolk City jail. And he kept the whole jail awake all night, cursing God in language that you and I have seldom heard. And yet here he is just a few years later, with a smile on his face and what looked like a brand new suit of clothes, saying in front of people, without any feeling of embarrassment or shame, "Through the grace of God, I haven't had a drink for 3 years." When that meeting broke up, Ham went with me and he got me a room. Didn't take my bottle away from me. He even spent the night with me, and I never could quite understand that because I smelled like something you don't usually find on street corners. Next morning, one of these men came and got me, took me to Lynchburg General Hospital. They put me in a private room, in a bed that had 2 clean sheets and a pillow with a pillowcase. And they treated me like I was somebody, and I didn't know what to make of this. And when it was time for me to leave, this man came and got me, and he paid the bill, and stopped off at the drugstore and bought them vitamin pills, and he paid for these because I didn't have 2 nickels to rub together. And for all of the following week, there was somebody with me around the clock from AA. They didn't even let me go to the bathroom by myself because they didn't trust me, and I didn't trust me either. And they spent a whole week telling me about the nice people that I'd meet when I got in shape to go to a meeting down at the clubhouse. And this frightened me because nice people never had been very nice to me. And I began wondering how I would be accepted, or even if I would be accepted, and how I would be treated. I wondered, too, what it would cost. They said it was free, that I had paid my dues. Hell, I never had paid for nothing. I was a thief. But they spent a whole week telling me about the many, many wonderful things that AA had done for them. And I believed it, because it showed. But could it do it for me? I didn't think so. Because literally everything in the book had been tried on me. I'd been preached at and prayed over. I'd been doctored on. I'd been psychoanalyzed. I'd been locked in and locked out and locked up. I'd been beat up, been lied to, been lied about. Doctors had told me many times that if I didn't quit drinking, I was going to die with cirrhosis of the liver. Psychiatrists had told me that if I even tried to quit, if it didn't kill me, I'd end up even more mentally unbalanced than I was. And that's just another way of saying, you ain't sick, you crazy as hell. Preachers had told me that if I died drunk, I was going to hell. One of them even told me that's where I ought to be. I even had one run-in with two representatives of our local chapter of the Women's Christian Temperance Union. There's an outfit for you. These two lovely little old ladies in them shuffling shoes, they fell in on me late one evening, and I'm down, defenseless. I'm batching, 'cause my wife, she been gone to Mama's. And they lit in on me with all 4 feet. They said I was a disgrace to my family, a disgrace to the town of Clover, Virginia, and you ought to know that damn town. They said I was a disgrace to the whole human race, that all I'd ever done was make one mistake after another ever since the day I was born. They even insinuated my being born was the biggest mistake. But I realize now that all of these were good, well-meaning people. A lot of people tried to help me. And every one of them did the very best they could with what they had. But nothing had ever worked for me. And I didn't think AA would either. I was sort of like the tomcat that got locked up in the taxidermy shop. I tried everything, but just didn't nothing work. And it was in this frame of mind that I went to my first meeting of Alcoholics Anonymous at the club room. And I don't know what I expected to find. But I was anything but prepared for what I did find. I walked into a nicely furnished club room about half the size of this room, and onto a group of people about 25 or 30. And I realized when I walked in that door, these are not the kind of people I've been living with on the riverbank. Because the men were well dressed and they were clean shaved. They had on clean shirts. 2 or 3 of them had on a necktie. One smart aleck even had on a coat. I didn't own a coat. And the ladies, they had the hair comb. And they had on lipstick. Didn't look like got hit in the mouth with it. Was on right. And they were smiling. These were happy people. And I felt that I didn't belong. But before I could duck out, and I was going to, a real pretty little lady from way over on the other side of the room got up and came all the way across to where I was. And she said, "My name is Ruth Dickens, and I'm glad you made it tonight." And she shook hands with me. God, I don't know how long it had been since somebody had shook hands with me. And it wasn't one of them flabby, wishy-washy nothings. It was the kind of handshake that said, I know all about you, but I love you. And somehow I knew Ruth Dickens meant just that. I didn't understand it, but I knew she meant it. And within the first 10 minutes, I shook hands with everybody in that room. And every one of them was just like Ruth. Somehow, some way, they knew all about me. But they loved me. And I hope I'll never forget how I was treated at my first AA meeting. Because I was treated like a gentleman. Never had been one. I was treated with respect. And I had never felt it for another human being. I was treated with utmost kindness. And I had never in my life done a kind or even a decent thing for anybody. Not even my own mother and father. I was subjected, I think, for the first time in my life to pure, unselfish love. And I honestly didn't know what it meant. And every now and then now, at a meeting I'll see one just like me, and there are not many like me that live to come to AA anymore. Most of them die in a dark alley with a knife in their back, or they freeze to death on some riverbank. But every now and then, after the meeting starts, nearly always, one like me will come sneaking in. And he's scared, because he wants so much to belong somewhere to somebody. And he doesn't know what's going to be accepted. And if I possibly can, when the meeting's over, I'll get to him, because I've seen at times people who have forgotten what it's like to be completely alone look at one of these and turn and walk away. And he sees it and he feels it. And he leaves. And he'll never come back. This should never happen at an AA meeting. It should never happen. There's a line in our big book. And the first time I read it, I thought it was put there just for me. But it wasn't. It was put there for every one of us that are here now and for the many, many more yet to come. It's the line that says, "For no case is too pitiful. No one has sunk so low as not to be welcome here. And for God's sake, for the sake of Alcoholics Anonymous and this beautiful thing that you and I have, the next time you see one of these, go to him and just shake hands. It may seem like a small thing to you, but it might very well be the biggest thing that ever happened in his life. It was in mine." They opened that meeting that night with a short prayer that I thought was without a doubt the most beautiful thing I'd ever heard in my life. A prayer that many, many times since then has meant the difference in this alcoholic being drunk and being sober. And they had a speaker, and I don't even remember the man's name. But I do remember that for the first time in my life, I heard alcoholism and alcoholics talked about in a way that made some sense. And I remember, too, that not once during this man's talk did he make me feel unwelcome or the least bit unclean. Not once did he make me feel that I was a bum or a scab on the face of society. He talked about a disease that had crippled me and millions of others like me, physically, mentally, and spiritually. And I still thank God for this man, because before he sat down that night, he had convinced me that if I was ever to know real sobriety, as you and I define sobriety in Alcoholics Anonymous, I had to do a whole lot more than just stop drinking. and I still believe this. If alcoholism is a threefold illness, then all three phases of that illness have to be treated, and changes in three areas of our lives have to be made before we can claim that we're sober. And I remember, too, that sometime during that meeting a feeling came over me that I had never in my life had the privilege of feeling. A feeling that let me say to myself, I've come home, and I'd never had a home. I have found my people. I belong. When the speaker sat down, the chairman got up again, and he picked up his big top hat. And he said, we don't have any dues or fees, and I thought, oh, hell, I know there's a catch to it somewhere. But then he said, when the hat passes you, you got a little, drop some in. If you haven't, take some out. And I thought, hell, you can't beat a deal like that. And I got me a quarter. And I didn't buy a drink with it, got cigarettes. I reckon it was maybe more than coincidence. The hat didn't pass me no more for several weeks. Somehow they got around. And then they closed that meeting, I imagine the same way we'll close this one. They stood and they held hands. And they very reverently prayed the Lord's Prayer. And I just stood there and cried. Because even though I wanted more than anything in my life to join them, I couldn't. Because I didn't know the words. I honestly didn't know the words to the Lord's Prayer. And that's what you had to work with some 25 years ago. A nothing from nowhere. And on the way out of that meeting, one of my sponsors, and I had 7. I needed 7. They took one look at me and said, we got to sublet this one. But this old gentleman, Ronald Watts was his name, and he's dead now. He put his arms around me and he said something that I believed with all my heart, and I don't know why I did, because it contradicted what people had been telling me for 19 years. He said simply, son, you don't ever have to drink again. Nobody had ever told me that I didn't have to. They said you drink too much. They said you ought to quit. But nobody ever said that I could. They never bothered to tell me how. But like I say, I believed Ronald that night, and I still do. I don't believe that there's a one of us in this room that will ever have to drink again. Some of us may do it. But if we do, it will not be because this program failed, because it never has. If you and I drink again, it will not be because God failed, because up to now He never has. Now, if you and I drink again, it'll be because in some situation we fail to use the tools that we've been given. And they're good tools, well tested by time and countless thousands of people just like you and me. From the very first, the program of Alcoholics Anonymous was good for me, because it taught me for the first time in my life the truth, something that I had never known. It taught me, first of all, the truth about alcohol, that while for some it may be just a beverage like Coca-Cola or iced tea, for me it is a deadly poison. For some reason, The beverage alcohol has the power to separate me from everything on God's green earth that I respect and love and want. And I don't know why, and I don't care. I'm just glad that I found out this is what separated me. It taught me the truth about myself. Basically, I'm not a bum. I'm not a nothing. I am a living, breathing child of God. It also taught me the truth about God. He's not a God of punishment. He never was. And not once in my life of ugliness has he ever punished me for anything. And it taught me the truth about you. You have never been my enemy. Never in my life have I had but one. Myself. And because this is a program of truth, and because I accepted it to the degree that it was possible for me, I was to know 11 years of a beautiful quality of sobriety. Something that was literally impossible for a thing with my background. I was to go 13 years without taking a drink. But for 2 of those 13 years, I was taking them little pellets. And if there's anybody here tonight that's taking tranquilizers, this is your business. And if you're taking them and you won't say you sober, that too is your business. And if you need them and you're taking them according to a doctor's prescription, then I won't even say that you're not sober. But if you take them the way I took them, if you got 2 or 3 doctors on the string and a couple of shady druggists on the side, and you taking them according to your prescription, and you still want to say you sober because you ain't drinking, that's your business. But I'll just say this, if I wake up in the morning and I got a question that needs a sober answer, I damn sure won't bug you with it. But because I am basically a selfish and a very egotistical person, after enjoying 11 years of a kind of life that was impossible and is still a little bit unbelievable, I deliberately, late in 1962, left AA. I deliberately turned my back on everything that you stand for. I even turned my back on a God that I never knew existed until you gave him to me. And for 5.5 months, I worked as hard as I've ever worked in my life simply for money, for me. And at the end of that 5.5 months, I had done exactly what I wanted to do. I had paid all of my debts. I had paid for my home. I had paid for 2 automobiles, paid for 2 small but nice farms, and I had what was for me quite a sum of money, several $1,000s stashed away in a bank. And I had every intention that night, when I realized that I had done what I set out to do, of going back to AA the next night and taking up where I left off. But on the way home that night, I had to pass a bootlegging joint. And in 13 years, God only knows how many times I'd passed it without ever thinking of going by that. But that night I stopped and I walked in, and you would have thought I hadn't missed a night in those 13 years. Nobody seemed surprised to see me. I walked up to that bar, and I remember saying to myself, I'll have just one and I'll go straight home. This was on April 15th, 1963. I got home sometime in the latter part of June. You know, this really is an illness. This is not a bad habit. 'Cause I don't care what you've been doing or how long you've been doing it. If you quit and go 13 years and don't do it, you've broken the habit. And I know that with all my heart, I had no intention of taking but just that one drink. But because this is a progressive illness, I went in a blackout before that night was over because I don't remember leaving that place. In fact, I don't really remember what happened for the next roughly 7 or 8 weeks. I vaguely remember waking up in a lot of strange places. Remember one or two occasions, too, very vaguely, of running through the woods and hearing shots fired and bullets ricocheting off trees. But when I finally got home, I found out I didn't have a home. Somehow my wife had gotten my name off of that deed, and I no longer had a wife or a family. I no longer had anything. But I learned a few days later I had about $3,000 worth of bad checks scattered over 5 counties. And if there's anybody here tonight that got a few years of sobriety and you've been kind of playing with the idea maybe mentally of what it would be like if you took a drink after all these years, let me tell you as briefly as I can what it's like. I hope I never forget how I felt when I swallowed that first drink after 13 years in Alcoholics Anonymous and having everything on earth I ever dreamed of. I felt like I was exactly what that little boy had called me that first day in public school. Uglier and filthier than I'd ever been in my life. And I have never in my life felt the hate that I felt with that first drink. And every bit of it was aimed at where it should have been. At myself. "15 months later, on July the 1st, 1964, in Charlotte County, Virginia, when I stood before Judge Page Morton and pled guilty to 2 charges of driving drunk, 2 charges of resisting arrest, 2 charges of resisting a police officer, and 1 charge of vagrancy. And I never did quite understand that, because I was living in a Cadillac. Parked it in a different cemetery every night. The judge said I had no visible means of support, and I reckon that's what got it. But late that afternoon, the judge very graciously allowed me to go to a place called Eastern State Hospital at Williamsburg, Virginia, and this is a state-owned and operated insane asylum. And late that afternoon, 2 deputy sheriffs from Charlotte County took me there. And I don't know how many days later I came to in what they call the receiving section, and I was tied to another bed. I never could understand why they tied me to them damn beds. I never fell out of bed in my life, drunk or sober. And I realized when I woke up that I was not alone in that room, because in there with me there was 5 mental patients. And we can tell the difference, drunk or sober. I learned, too, later that they don't ordinarily keep a patient in the receiving section there for 24 hours. But it was 5 days before they untied me. And what happened during those 5 days I've never talked about. And I never will. Except to say I think it's criminal to lock mentally deranged people in a room by themselves and leave them unattended. To bite, to claw, to mutilate each other while they're watched through a peephole by a breed of humans that think even this is funny. I've got some brand new scars on me as reminders of those 5 days. And I'm glad I've got them. Because now if I ever get to thinking that I'm something special, and that God owes me some special treatment, all I've got to do is look at these scars and I'm reminded all over again just exactly who I am and what I am and by whose grace I'm where I am. I found out a few days later, too, that I was not in that insane asylum on alcoholic papers. I was there on mental papers. And this, too, is exactly as it should have been. Because if you've been sober and enjoyed the benefits of sobriety, all of the fringe benefits, the respect of your family, respect for other people and of other people, and you trade all of this for one drink of anything, you crazy. Yes, I should have been there on mental papers. 43 days from the time I was committed there by the court, I escaped. I ran. And that first night out, I went to a meeting of Alcoholics Anonymous. And when the meeting was over, me and 2 more winos, we got us a jug and we got drunk. And this was to be my pattern for 5 hellishly long years. And once again, it was to be necessary for me to go back to that place called hell and to walk its streets barefooted, to panhandle on the street for nickels and dimes to buy cheap wine, to sleep in parked cars and under porches and in junkyards and on the riverbanks, to wrap up when the weather was cold in newspapers to literally keep from freezing to death, to go late at night to the back door of a restaurant and scratch through a garbage can for something to eat because the few pennies that I could bum couldn't go for something this unnecessary. And if you've been wondering what it's like, give it some thought. And for God's sakes, don't try it. You don't have to make that mistake. A lot of us made it for you. Some 4.5 or 5 years ago, one of my sponsors was more than 18 years of as good a quality of sobriety as I ever knew a man to have. During this 18 years, this man had worked himself up to executive vice president of the largest construction firm in that part of the country. But with each promotion, he was given a little more responsibility, calling for more and more demands of his time, leaving less and less for AA. And this particular night, some 4.5 or 5 years ago, at a cocktail party given by his company, he drank one little harmless highball. Less than 3 weeks later, he went out in his garage one afternoon and he stuck a .45 pistol in his mouth and he blew the whole top of his head off. And I loved that man. His name, Ham Masters. The only one of the 4 that I could identify with. Give it some thought. You and I have no guarantee that we will ever be given another chance at this. But because the God that you gave me is a God of kindness, and because even in spite of all my wrongness and all my rottenness, in his infinite kindness and mercy, he has always dealt very gently with me. On July 24th, 1968, he saw fit once again to give me the most precious thing that an alcoholic ever hoped for, the gift of sobriety. That's what it was like. And that's what happened. What's it like now? There aren't any words of mine, really, to describe what it's like now. Not too long after I got sober the second time, I had no family, I had nobody really. But at a meeting in Greensboro, North Carolina, one Sunday night, I met one of the most beautiful creatures that God ever created. She's with me tonight. She's my wife. And I've come to love this woman as much as God will let a man love another human being. And every time I look at her, I'm reminded that this beautiful God must have loved me very, very much, or I never would have met her. She's one of the gentle people. And I think of her as God's gift to me. And she's one of the most precious things that ever happened in my life. Together, she and I, this year, will know 7 beautiful years of sobriety. January the 10th, we had 5 beautiful years together as husband and wife. And if there's anybody in this room tonight that's brand new, and you wonder if things can happen to you, good things, look around you at these people. Look particularly into their eyes. There's a light there. And if you stay with them and stay close to this light, one day it'll warm you to the depths of your very soul. But this light didn't get in their eyes simply by sitting in a meeting. They have put something into Alcoholics Anonymous. And don't expect to get any more from this program than you're willing to put into it. And with all the earnestness that I have, I beg you, for God's sake, don't ever play with this program. Your sobriety and my sobriety is an outright gift from a kind and a loving God. And that gift is free for whatever length of time it takes you to learn how to live by the principles set forth in the 12 steps of this program. When you've learned that, and for God's sakes, don't drag your feet. When you've learned it, you begin to earn it, one day at a time, by putting these principles to work in your everyday life. And you have no guarantee of your sobriety if you try it any other way. If there's a step that's bothering you, don't skip over it to the next one because you're not ready for the next one. Go to your sponsor, and if you haven't got one, get one. Too many people are trying to make it today on their own. We all need sponsors. I have less now than I've ever had in the 25 years since I came here. I have 5 now, and I talk to at least 3 of them at least once a week because I need them. You need yours. And I guess the real reason I'm here tonight is just to show that good things can happen in Alcoholics Anonymous, even to a thing like me. And if you're brand new, please keep coming back, because there's help here, because there's love here. And in Alcoholics Anonymous, we have different kinds of love. First is our love for each other. And this is a tremendous thing. Because among the membership of Alcoholics Anonymous, you find men and women from literally every walk of life. We've got doctors and lawyers, ministers, priests, nurses, housewives, mechanics, successful businessmen, successful career women, and a lot of bums like me. But here in Alcoholics Anonymous, social standing or financial position is neither a hindrance nor a help. It matters not which side of the tracks you came from, because here you and I are bound together in fellowship by one common problem. And in our search together for a solution to that problem, there's born within each of us a feeling for one another. And that feeling is love. And it is a tremendous thing. Then there's another love. Our love for God. And where else on the face of the earth tonight is there a group of people with any greater reason for loving God than you and I have? For without it, we wouldn't have made it to this point. And this too is a tremendous thing. But there's still another love, far greater than both of these. God's love for us. And I hope I'm never vain enough to think that I can explain God's love or even understand it. But a few years ago, while working at the tobacco market down in Georgia, I heard a story that to me exemplifies perfectly this particular love. It's the story of an old sharecropping farmer and his family that lived in the northern part of Georgia. And if any of you are familiar with that part of the country, you know as I do that from an agricultural standpoint, North Georgia is not the most blessed spot on earth. Any man that digs a living out of the ground fully deserves the few blessings that he gets. But according to this story, this particular year, when the crops were sold and the cotton seed and the fertilizer bills were paid, there was a little money left over. Not much, just $5. But it was the first time there'd ever been any left over since this family had been a family. And they thought that it called for some kind of a celebration. But knowing the value of $1, they knew that they couldn't each one go out and buy something. So they got out the Sears and Roebuck catalog, and after much thumbing through the pages, they finally settled on one thing that they could all enjoy equally. It was a looking glass, a mirror. None of them had ever seen one. And they made out the order and they mailed it off, and after many days of anxious waiting, the postman blew the horn down at the mailbox, and they went down and got it. And later they gathered around the kitchen table and they opened it. And of course, Pa, being the head of the household, was the first one to see himself in that mirror. And when he looked at himself for the first time, all he said was, "Well, I'll declare." And he handed it to his wife, and she looked, and she just smiled. And she gave it to little sis, the little teenage daughter, and she looked, and she preened, and she giggled. And then it was little Joe's turn. Little Joe was one of the gentle people. Little fellow about 12 or 13. Back when he was a wee small child, he'd been kicked in the face by a mule. And he wasn't a handsome child. And when he saw himself for the first time, he didn't know whether to laugh or cry. And he turned to his mom and he said, "Ma, did you know I look like this?" She said, "Yes, son. I knowed it all the time." He said, "You knowed I was this ugly, and you still loved me?" She said, "Yes, son. I love you 'cause you're mine." And you know, I think this must be the kind of love that God has for you and for me. For surely He has seen us in all of our ugliness. None of the rotten things that you and I did were hidden from Him. He saw them all. Yet when the day came and we found ourselves flat of our backs, unable to even get up, much less stay up, we knew that day we couldn't go any further without help. But we knew, too, there was no need to expect help from family, because the family was gone. Nor was there any need to expect help from friends, because the friends, too, were gone. And that didn't leave anybody but God. And we hated to ask because we were ashamed to. But we did ask because we had to. Remember what happened? Without once reminding us of any of the rotten things we'd done to hurt ourselves, to hurt other people, and to hurt him. Without one word of reproach, without a moment's hesitation, he simply reached out a hand that held all the help that you and I will ever need. That hand is still there. It always will be. It's the hand of AA. To you and me, it's the hand of our sponsors. To the 9 million or more who are still out there stumbling around in the dark, it's your hand. And it's my hand. And it must always be there. For these are the terms of your sobriety and my sobriety. We have to give it away, or we'll lose it. I'm glad I'm an alcoholic. I'm grateful to the bottom of my heart for all the years of loneliness, of being without a home and without a family. Grateful for the time spent in hospitals and jails and insane asylums. Because rough though it may have been, it was a small price to pay for what I've found here with you. I'm grateful even for those 5 miserable years that I had to go back to that place called hell, because it taught me something that I may never have known otherwise. It taught me that without the grace of God, without your help, by myself I'm nothing but a drunken bum. And that's all I could ever be. I'm glad I'm an alcoholic because that alone enabled me to become one of you, and a part of this beautiful thing that you and I know is AA. And I know, too, that I belong in AA because I belong to you. And you belong to me. And it's always been this way, really. Ever since that night you found me on the street corner and I had no place to go. And you took me with you and you brought me here. And you told me I belonged, and you told me to stay with you and to keep coming back. And even though a few years later, like a silly, irresponsible child, I ran away to get hurt again, when I finally made it back, once again you accepted me, the unacceptable. Once again you allowed me to become a part of your lives. You gave me a place in your hearts. And I want to stay in this place, because I know that there's happiness for me here, and safety from myself. And I hope and pray with all my heart that I may never again turn my back and walk away from this to drink again, because I might not make it back another time. But if for any reason one of us should have to leave, I'd much rather it be me than you, because for all that you have done and are still doing for me, I love you. I'm sorry it's taken me so long to say so little, but thank you so much for listening. Thank you for everything I have that's worth having. Thank you for everything I know that's worth knowing. But thank you most of all just for being what you are, my family. And when you say your prayers tonight, please pray for me. I'll do the same thing for you. God bless you.
Wasn't that wonderful, people? There was no con job when I told you what to expect tonight. Believe you me. Talbot, we have a little memento of the meeting and we'd like for you to carry with us, and when you look at it, think of the people that love you in Maryville and return to us on every occasion, please. Thank you for your love. Let's close the meeting by standing and holding hands and repeating our Lord's Prayer. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, the power, and the glory, forever and ever.